Hello and welcome to the MoneyMagpie Invest podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles, founder of MoneyMagpie.com. And before we get into this, do remember to subscribe to us, like it, comment. I always look at your comments, and tell all your friends about how fantastic this podcast is. You know you want to, particularly when you find out who I've got today as my guest, because my guest today is a friend of mine, Mark Draper, who has been described by the Financial Times as one of Britain's top electricity executives. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Jasmine. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's great to have you on because you and I have spoken about electricity production, energy production a few times. And I thought it was time that we got you onto the podcast so that everybody else can get a bit of your wisdom. Because it wasn't that long ago, it was a few weeks ago, that you and I were talking about France, Spain, and Portugal going dark for a full 24 hours. That was just a few months ago. And you said, and I was pretty staggered by this, you said 24 hours wasn't that much. If it happened in this country, it would be 3 days. Seriously, explain, please.
Okay, yeah, you're very welcome, Jasmine, and a good start. Maybe a little bit of background and context. I have worked in the electricity industry for over 40 years, all about producing electricity, generating from all the sources over those 40 years. Started from a big, centralised, nationalised electricity generating board, and now into a very fragmented, privatised electricity board with a lot of people playing with different interests. At the end of the day, the job's the same. Let's try and keep the lights on in the UK. And for all of that time, we've worried about a thing called a black event, which is when, for a variety of reasons, the grid, which is balanced second by second, minute by minute, 24/7, might go dark. That is, too many power stations drop off, the demand just gets too high, you have some unexpected faults, or these days, even unexpected terrorist events or interventions, which you've got to avoid, but cyber is very, very popular now, as you know. In those cases, you've got to rebuild the whole grid starting at ground zero. And indeed, we'd expected for the full blackout in the UK, it would take you 3 days to get it all back on. And believe me, even that will be a good job because it relies on everything keeping together and going all the time. Once it goes dark, everything then gets difficult, from the actual power station sources to communication via telephones to people getting in cars to go and sort things because you can't pay for fuel. A blackout is a real problem in a modern day country, not like the 1970s where we enjoy sitting around the candles and telling each other stories. We rely on it every second of every day. And so we really have to spend a lot of time avoiding this. And that would be a key message we need to talk about today.
And I was quite interested to hear, and this might just be the way it was reported, but that this blackout time happened not long after these countries said, "Oh, go for us! We're going completely green. Look, we've got green energy. Aren't we marvelous?" Was that a bit of a coincidence, or was there a connection there?
No, no coincidence at all. No coincidence at all, Jasmine. Electricity generation stroke supply has three really top priorities, sometimes called a trilemma. You might know this from before. One is you want your energy to be affordable. I think that's pretty important. Also, you need it secure. It's got to always be there. Third, and I would say third in that order, is wouldn't it be great it can be sustainable, however you want to define that. Now, the trouble is in recent administrations, right from the top, the only thing people worry about is sustainable. They somehow assume it'll be secure, because we've been pretty good at that as an industry over the years. There's been very few blackouts of any note. And they hope it's going to be affordable, but a surprise when it gets very expensive because no one's doing the sums. So that's the bottom line, Jasmine. So, yeah, absolutely, as you say, you can only make it secure if you focus on the things that make your energy secure, and that isn't renewables. Do you know what, Jasmine? The sun doesn't shine every day. The wind doesn't always blow. Even if it's very reliable, you can't suddenly turn it on. You've always been able to turn on conventional power stations and you keep enough spare in your back pocket. So on that difficult day, you turn up more plant. Now those plants are needed just to make up for the fact that suddenly the sun doesn't shine, suddenly the wind doesn't blow. And as we've invested in renewables, which is a pretty expensive business, even if carbon free, we haven't invested alongside, because it costs even more, the backup power stations. Because despite the great talk about diversification, the reality is all of that renewables might not be blowing. I can guarantee overnight tonight there'll be no sunshine. Guess what? I can also guarantee if it's a windless day, most of the UK is free of wind. So everything has to come from other sources. And as we've sort of discussed between ourselves, if you're really not bothered about nuclear and you phase out your conventional sources, you don't have any other sources. So what are you going to do?
Yeah, what are we going to do? Because from what you're saying, we really are quite close to going dark at any point. If we are trying to have more and more renewables, and those are not anything that you can really rely on, and we're not building up the backups, well, surely we're days away from going dark.
Yeah, I mean, let's not be too dramatic here. It just doesn't have the priority and balance it should have against the other priorities. I don't sit here worried about we're days away from going dark. I do know that a great challenge at the moment is making sure we don't go dark, and that is building a whole portfolio of grid services we didn't used to happen. Now, grid service is quite exotic. It's a little bit exotic, but it's about balancing the system, the electricity system I talk about. It's about keeping the voltage right. It's about keeping the frequency right. And that used to be done as almost a byproduct of our big traditional power stations. If you don't have big traditional power stations and you really want to rely on wind turbines out at sea or on someone's rooftop or a solar panel, you need those services to come elsewhere. And so those are now being actively bought by the grid in a variety of auctions and other contracting rounds, all of which hopefully will enable us to balance the system. But it's all costing money and it's all a bit behind the time. If you like, we've rushed into renewables because we think it's great without thinking about the costs or the implications on the system.
So you're saying you're going to auction everything. So that means that countries around the world are bidding, and we're getting energy from all sorts of other countries, not producing it ourselves.
Well, that's a secondary point, but one of the things we do tend to rely on is links now to other countries, particularly Europe. We're well linked and getting increasingly well linked to continental Europe, which is great, but only works if those continental links keep flowing and they are traded across them. It's a free trade. But you know what? If the power price is higher or the need's greater in France, it won't come this way. And we have no control over that. So we've certainly lost, Jasmine, an important leg of the security debate, which is, are we energy independent? Have we got control over our own destiny? And sadly, in the power case, we increasingly haven't.
Which is madness. I mean, surely one thing that we've learned from the Ukraine war is that we need to have independence when it comes to not only energy, actually, but food as well. Surely we should be going in the opposite direction. We should be going, right, we're going to build nuclear power stations, we're going to drill, we're going to do whatever it takes to create our own energy. Wouldn't that be the sensible move?
Of course it would. It's absolutely obvious. But sadly, in the recent political climate where we believed everyone could be friends and global trade means everyone will always trade for everyone and no one goes invading countries or hostile acts, then you believe it's okay. So you can always source gas from the cheapest provider. You can always move electricity across a link. The reality is, and of course the US has been pretty good at proving this, you need your own independence. And you've mentioned them. I wish we could be sure we're growing our own food so we don't rely on imports, and the same for power. And we do have sources of power internally, both renewables and more nuclear. And we should still be sourcing gas and using gas where it makes sense in power stations. That's available to us, but we've ignored it, and now I'm afraid we might pay it. We might have ignored it at our peril because life could get difficult without that independence. We don't want to go cap in hand to other countries or to the global markets when we haven't got enough power of our own. Look at the prices when the Ukraine invasion happened. We had all the energy. We just had to pay a fortune to get it because we couldn't control it within our own borders.
So are you saying that we should be doing fracking, for example? I mean, you're talking about, gas being available. Is that through fracking or is that through other means?
Well, I mean, I think it's a good debate happening today as we speak, Jasmine. That if Norway's still exploiting and extracting gas out of the North Sea and selling it to us to burn in our power plants and in our homes, why is it we're saying, but we mustn't because that'll damage the whole global economy? I do believe it's right to try and move to a low carbon based economy where it makes sense and in a way it makes sense. We have done our fair as a heavy lifting in the UK. It's amazing what we have done for a variety of reasons, only some of which are to do with the agenda. There are other reasons why we moved away from high carbon sources. But yeah, absolutely, it makes sense to use the sources we have while we have them. And one of those is North Sea gas. You mentioned fracking. Fracking is more difficult because we haven't got a lot of it. We're not naturally bent towards it. It's on land and causes political difficulties. I'd say the jury's still out on that one. I wouldn't be advocating fracking, but I would be saying if you've got energy sources of your own, I think the Severn and tidal range on the Severn's a great one. Why on earth wouldn't we use it? Some people would love to have that on their doorstep. We haven't even managed to use it. So we've got to take control of our own agenda and use those sources we have and push them through. You mentioned earlier a bit of courage. we get overridden by the NIMBYs saying, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that, and I don't want to do that. Well, that's great, but guess what? Your lights are going to go out and your beer's going to get warm. So what are we going to do?
Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned North Sea gas. What about North Sea oil? Because again, there's Norway drilling happily. Shouldn't we be getting the drills out there with North Sea oil as well?
Um, well, I guess because we're focused on power here, oil doesn't play through to power other than really in the price of gas. We don't use any oil to turn into power in the UK of any significance. So they're almost separate. Would I advocate using drilling and continuous oil? The world still needs it. It gives a level of independence. We're going to phase our way off it in due course. But I think the energy transition is a really important thing. You don't suddenly go from like 100% carbon reliance to zero overnight. You work out what makes sense and move yourself sensibly in a way you can afford and does make sense. I mean, right now, if you or a close relative is on the operating table, you'd get a lot of comfort by knowing the power's backed up by gas and oil that's in the tank, as opposed to, well, you better hope the wind keeps blowing or those lights are going out and someone's going to die on the table.
Well, very true. So you're saying certainly that we've moved too fast, too far to renewables. What would you say would be, the optimum right now? Are there any power stations that we should reopen or anything that we should do to make it a little bit better and a bit more reliable, frankly?
Um, So that's a difficult question because it's difficult to reverse anything that's already happened, and a lot of this lies in the hands of policymakers, which is in government, and governments are only here for short terms. Even a long term in government's 15 years, but an average power station lasted 50 years. The last coal station to close was, and that's only in recent years, was consented in a government that had a certain Harold Macmillan as the head of it. So that tells you how long these decisions are, and therefore how bad it is to let our politicians meddle for basically short-term agendas and gains. I think what's been needed for a while is some sustained view of there is no perfect answer. Why don't you try and, through the markets, because we are market based, push towards proportions, which means stuff doesn't get ruled out completely. I've had for a long time what I loosely call a 2020 vision, which is, if we had 20% nuclear and made sure we kept 20%, and we had 20% gas and made sure we kept 20%, and 20% renewable and kept 20%, and left the other 40% to what's free and happens in the market, which might be biomass, might be links, it's a good start. And when things swing in the markets or political agendas, you've still got some bedrocks and some flexibility to play with. If the only agenda is why aren't we 100% renewable and we close everything else down, we're obviously subject to vagaries of the whole renewable pricing and so on, and all the same for all the others. So I guess this is a game where we need a portfolio of approaches to keep us robust, whatever the climate throws at us of the day.
And what about customer facing? Because, for example, we've got the Ofgem cap coming up in October where they're putting the price up, they're increasing the cap, even though I've heard that actually gas and electricity are cheaper at the moment. It seems that the cost, and this is what I'm hearing, the cost is coming from the extra cost of renewables. Is that the case? Have you heard why the price is going up?
Look, the price of what the customer pays for electricity is very much driven by the base cost of electricity, which is the fuel, but then all the add-ons we put on them. Now, we've decided as a policy, as a country, again from politicians, we don't want to charge the taxpayer for that. We charge it all to the customer bill. So everything we decide to do, from building a new transmission line to supporting a new offshore wind farm to building the new balancing equipment we need to keep electricity on, gets charged to customer in some form or another. That includes all the inefficiencies in the system. If we pay a wind farm millions to keep offload because we can't take its energy because it's a very windy night they demand, that all gets loaded on the customer. So you're absolutely right to suspect all the policy ends up costing the customer. And guess what? What that ends up doing is driving people to go overseas, to go off grid, not to use electricity. But those costs don't get any less when everyone does that. So the last person standing in the UK connected grid has a £7 billion bill or whatever the number is. So it's quite ridiculous, really. We make everything more expensive. We shove all these costs. People don't want it. They go away from us. And then the costs on the remaining get big and big. So we're in one of those vicious circles where it's only going to get worse unless we grab hold of it and say, we've got to get our costs more competitive. We've got to keep these down because that in turn means people stay here. They use the energy. They bring manufacturing some degree of service back. And guess what? That's good for the UK economy.
So is this the fault of government, or is it the fault of the individual private companies that are running it, or is it a mixture of it?
Good question, Jasmine. I think you've got to say it's all about policy. I think it's always been about policy. The government, all the companies we talk about are basically investor owned. They'll go where the money leads them. They'll look for good returns. They'll look for good investments. And obviously, all the good investments has been build renewables, and we'll give you offtake contracts. We'll give you CFDs. We'll give you other ways of making your money back, in theory. So that's where everyone's been led towards. At the same time, legislation's meant you can't burn coal. You increasingly can't burn gas. You've now got to prove for any lab have any size you're CCS ready, as in carbon capture. Very contentious because carbon capture in early forms. Will it really work? Well, hopefully so. Does it make sense to put it everywhere? Probably not. What about the costs? Well, we'll load them on the poor old customer once again. So let's have an adult debate about, does that make sense? Do we really want to do it? How much are we going to gamble on that? Yet the government's mantra at the moment is you just can't do it if you're not going to be carbon ready, and that's very expensive. And that's before we even say that the answer is clearly hydrogen, which again is very contentious and even more expensive.
It's a whole mess of policy and private companies and the consumer and trying to keep the lights on while trying to be green at the same. It's a mess. It really does feel like a mess. It's amazing, frankly, that we keep going. So if you were running things, if you were prime minister, and I'm sure that like me, you'd rather not be prime minister, but if you were and you could sort out the energy situation in this country, what would your first moves be?
Oh wow. What a challenge. Well, I guess sadly, if I was Prime Minister, the first thing I wouldn't worry about is the energy position, probably, because it's one of the better ones in reality. As you said, the lights keep on, they're a bit expensive. I'd be asking Ed Miliband to try and do what he could to sort that out, and let's have a look at it seriously. But that wouldn't be top of my in tray, I suspect. If what we really say is where does the answer to all this lie? It's certainly in getting a grip of the policy, which has gone far too towards build renewables, whatever the cost. We've got to push affordability up the agenda in terms of that's a key challenge. When you come into my office to want to build a new power plant, I'm not going to say, is it green? Here's a tick. I'm going to say, well, what's its degree of greenness? But by the way, what's it going to cost to customers? Does it make sense? How much money do you need from government? Where's that going to get loaded into customer base? And I'm going to look for efficiencies in the way we run and operate the system because I think a lot of um, our organisation has got expensive and too overblown. Probably the same problem we've got generally in the country is that we've lost the idea of being competitive and lean and productive, even though we've been through privatisation. That's now a long time ago, and if we're not careful, we're now a bit fat, lazy, and happy. And I want us to be competitive and challenging on a worldwide scale.
And on that subject, this is, of course, MoneyMagpie Invest. It's an invest podcast. And there's a lot to say about investing in energy. Of course, we've been talking about the private companies, the publicly listed companies that own a lot of the energy production or the energy dissemination in this country. We've got E.ON, we've got British Gas, Centrica. We've got companies that are generally and very often doing very nicely, thank you very much, in the stock market. How do you see the future for investors when it comes to the energy sector? Do you think it's an area that has a lot of a good future, or are there some difficult headwinds that you can see?
I think the advantage about the electricity industry, it's always going to be around here. When people are joking about their company, I always remind them survival isn't compulsory. Not every company has to survive and not every sector has to provide. But I would say people are always going to be eating food and they're always going to be needing electricity. So it's not a bad place to be. Don't expect to make stellar returns. If you do, that's great. But reliable returns should be available because guess what? We need billions of investment, both in generation plant and the grid support that goes with it, the grid upgrades, and then the other assets and services going with it. So there'll continue to be a huge inflow of cash, and there should be healthy returns for investors in the right places. Some of the stuff's got a bit overblown, so you need to be careful about that. I do think the re-emergence of onshore wind should be a good opportunity. Places with planning and a grid connection, it's always been a very highly lucrative return because onshore wind is much cheaper than offshore wind and much more able to be delivered in a controlled and short time scale. But traditionally, as you know, there was a moratorium on it. So I think there might be opportunity there. Solar's been a bit overblown. Batteries, it's difficult to make money on, and they're not long-term solutions. But maybe some of the more innovative answers, which are trying to keep the grid stable and secure and the lights on, and a few companies are doing that with the contract, is another good way that there may be availability to make money in the market.
And I assume that many of the traditional ways are still worth putting money into, particularly as they seem to be cheaper than they should be, because so many companies and individuals are like, oh no, that's dirty energy. I'm not putting my money into that. But as you say, we're always going to need energy, and it's going to take a while really to do the proper transition. So the coal-fired power stations and the companies that produce those, I would assume that those are still worth considering.
Yeah, I mean, we don't burn coal anymore in the UK, so I think we can ignore that. Round the world, people do and will, and that kit's always important. I suspect we're more gas based, really, but all the gas turbine manufacturers and so on are going to continue to get big order books. Does that turn to good share price? Well, it tends to depend where the share price is now and whether they're being oversold or undersold at the moment. But look, they've all got a marketplace. They should be able to make money out of it. So that could be a good opportunity for investors. Likewise, the utility companies in the UK, they're yielding a decent return. They're going to do the right things ultimately. Which one's going to be good? Well, you pay your money and take your choice, don't you, really? But hey, they're going to be around for a while. And as long as the price is okay at the moment, they're going to continue to yield a decent dividend. So it's not a bad place to put your money, but keep an eye on it.
And finally, Mark, I was just thinking about this black hole that the governments kept talking about. They said it was 22 billion. It's now apparently 50 billion. I just wonder if we got rid of some of the net zero projects, and there are some huge ones that Miliband has brought out, if we actually sort of close down some of those, if we'd be able to close up much of that black hole, because it would be, I would have thought, a saving of billions to do that. Would it, or do you not see any savings there?
Well, I'd love them to do that, but remember those savings would just mean the bills are going to be more modest for the future. Very little, I stand to be corrected, it comes out of the general taxation where you're going to fill your black hole, goes into the electricity industry. All the excess we've talked about and the renewable projects and paying for all that and grid upgrades ends up loaded back onto the customer. So you and I pay through our electricity bill, but government in Whitehall isn't paying. So that's not going to help the famous Rachel's black hole very much, but it would help bring our bill down, which ultimately might mean people feel more productive and doing better, and that might mean more general taxation bill. So there isn't that direct link between what we're ploughing into, if you like, power for the future and the black hole. But hey, it's got to be right to save money. Things are pretty tough at the moment, and the black hole's going to make it worse. So in some ways, I want the government to balance its books, but I'm much more concerned about the cost of the electricity on the bill that everyone's going to have to pay. And I want that lower because I want people to be able to afford it. I think having electricity is a basic right. And I want industry to be competitive with their global competitors. And that means they need a competitive energy price. And that's just not available in the UK at the moment.
Very good point. Well, thank you, Mark. Mark Draper, this has been really useful to talk to you. Mark Draper is, according to the Financial Times, one of the top electricity executives in the country, and he has 40 years of experience in the business and a lot of knowledge to impart. Thank you so much for that, Mark Draper. This has been the Money Magpie Invest podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles, founder of Money Magpie. As I said at the start, subscribe, like, comment, and come back next week for next week's podcast. Bye.